Order, order. Good afternoon and welcome to the Women and Equalities Select Committee. Today we're holding the first session of our inquiry into community cohesion. We're delighted to be joined with Dame Sara Khan. Thank you for coming and welcome. I'm hoping that this will be a larger piece of work for the community cohesion work that we're doing as Women and Equalities Committee, and it is incredibly timely. So we're very grateful to have you as our first witness. Catherine, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome, Sara. It's lovely to meet you. Thank you for coming in. A very broad question to begin with. What's your assessment of the state of cohesion in the UK, both at a national and local level?
So when I started my review into social cohesion, that was obviously one of the very first questions I wanted to answer myself. And what I realised very early on was that it was difficult to answer that question, because in the absence of a comprehensive cohesion framework, it's very difficult to give a full and detailed picture of what social cohesion looks like in the UK. And so the reality is that there's an incomplete and inconsistent, and at times a contradictory picture of social cohesion. And so, that is a significant problem. What I would say is that, having reviewed some of the indicators relevant to social cohesion, and in subsequent reports that I've published since I did the review, my view very much is that we are seeing a decline of social cohesion in our country. And I think the UK is also at chronic risk of witnessing democratic decline as well. And so, just to give a couple of examples of some of the social cohesion indicators which has led me to this view, we are seeing declining civic engagement. We're seeing declining levels of volunteering, and we saw that wonderful spike of volunteering during the COVID pandemic, but that's against a backdrop of declining volunteering. We're seeing declining social capital, looking at the relationship between the state and the trust that individuals have with the state. That's always been a very important indicator of social cohesion. And on that side, we're seeing increasing disillusionment with democracy. We are seeing, for example, now in 2024, from data from last year, that trust in government is at an all-time low. We're seeing growing levels of distrust amongst the public towards democratic institutions, so declining trust in Parliament, in political parties, in the media, the mainstream media. We're seeing declining levels of trust amongst, and a new trend is the police, civil service, the courts. Voter turnout is at the lowest level now, so we know that in 2019, I think it was 64% of people who voted. In 2019, it was 67.5% for the voter turnout. Last year, it was at 64%. We're seeing increasing levels of polarisation. So data from 21 countries show that, of course, America, I don't think this is surprising, has the highest levels of political polarisation. The UK is the second country out of 21 countries that has the highest rates of political polarisation. And when you look at the research around what that results in, it shows that countries that have the highest rates of political polarisation contribute to democratic backsliding and erosion. So that, in a nutshell, has led me to the view that we are seeing declining levels of social cohesion, and I fear that we are at the beginning of what is a chronic and gradual decline of democratic trust. And this is not a theoretical conversation, because trust and confidence is the basis of a functioning democracy. If you lose that, and people lose their trust in the organs of state, it becomes very difficult for government to function. So it's a real serious concern. And just to end on your question, if you look at global future trends now, I don't know if you saw the World Economic Forum Global Risks Report that was published in January earlier this year, but again they highlighted in the next 2 to 10 years some of the most concerning global risks are to do with social cohesion. So, for example, the impact and rise of misinformation and disinformation. Societal polarisation was one that they identified. I think another one was high levels of inequality. And I think the 10th most concerning global risk they identified was the erosion of human rights and civil liberties. So even if you look at the global trends, unfortunately, they are also painting a really worrying picture. that I think liberal democracies are going to have to really pull their socks up and try to respond and prevent.
Absolutely. Yeah, you're right. You paint a very worrying picture, but it's good to hear where you think the lay of the land is right now. So you've called for improvements on how cohesion is measured. It'd be great to hear a little bit about the standardised framework that you are suggesting and what it would look like. And I read with interest about the social fabric index, and I wondered if you found that a helpful measurement tool.
Yes, I did. And we used some of the data from there, which was very helpful. But it doesn't capture everything that I would consider that you would need to look at in terms of social cohesion, which is slightly different to the social fabric. I did commission the Belong Network as a part of the review to put together what they considered to be what would be a helpful framework to measure social cohesion. And so they did put something together quite comprehensive, and it included, for example, let me just pull it out because it was quite a big piece of work. They identified, for example, a whole range of different measurements that could be used to measure social cohesion. So, for example, things like the attitudes that we have towards other people, trust, measuring things like belonging. And so they identified 6 key areas that could be useful to measure. It's interesting because other countries are measuring social cohesion. So I identified Australia. That's a very fascinating country where they've been measuring it for around, it's been at least 15 years now that they've been measuring social cohesion. And interestingly, the Australian government commissions a non-governmental organisation to measure social cohesion, but everybody uses that data. And again, that they look at a set of around 29 questions around 5 domains. So it's interesting because there's a lot of academic work that shows you can measure social cohesion despite its complexity. Other countries are doing it. I think the question we have to ask ourselves is, why is it that despite 20 years worth of social cohesion reviews, commissions, reports, we have still not institutionalised cohesion? We are still not measuring social cohesion. We don't know whether cohesion is improving or worsening in an area. We know government sometimes funds local authorities to improve social cohesion. We don't know if that money is of value. Is it demonstrating the results? And so I do find it incredible that after all this time, we've not actually built a social cohesion, and I would argue a democratic resilience framework, because to have that would be very useful for a whole host of reasons. Obviously to measure progress, as I stated, but also to measure the impact of interventions, but also to hold local authorities to account. If it's very easy for, and I saw this myself on a number of occasions, for a councillor to come to me and say, no, we're great, we don't have any problems, everything's wonderful here, everything is outside, there's no problems in my area, and I heard that all the time. But have to have an objective, impartial, independent framework that can really measure social cohesion is really important. But also I think it would be very useful in having a framework that would provide an early detection, really. It'd be like an early warning scheme where you can start to see, there are problems arising in certain parts of the country. The red signs are flashing. We need to do something about it. It can be done. It's just, the question is, why hasn't government done it to date, despite 20 years' worth of reports and reviews?
Thank you, Catherine. David.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Sara, for coming in today. I want to look at the sort of the local setting and how, I guess, some of the issues we've got there. So what factors would you say can make some areas more prone than others, again, when they've got similar demographics to extremist behaviour and other threats to community cohesion?
That's a very good question. And again, one of the challenges we had was that Whitehall doesn't have that data to tell us what areas, local areas, make it resilient. What are the factors that make it resilient to extremist or divisive activity? And what are the factors that make it susceptible to extremism? And at the moment, Whitehall doesn't keep that level of data. And so that, again, in the absence of a cohesion framework, we don't have a full understanding and picture of that. Just to give an example, I went to one area where they were measuring social cohesion quite quite, in depth, where they could understand certain parts of the, where wards, where they could pin it down to quite detailed analysis of which wards had a problem around social cohesion. And often there's this view that where there are high levels of deprivation and socioeconomic concerns, those areas will be the ones that have high cohesion concerns, but they found that wasn't the case. And there's a big debate around actually in the academic literature about, well, if you have high levels of deprivation and socioeconomic concerns, will that result in social cohesion challenges? There's a big debate about that, because I don't think the academic findings on that is conclusive. So it's a very difficult question to answer. I suppose if you look at the summer riots that we had that broke out in 27 towns and cities, interestingly, a lot of the data has shown that some of those areas did have high levels of socioeconomic concerns, high levels where there's disillusionment and distrust of institutions like the police, but also there were other factors such as the spread of disinformation, the involvement of far-right actors and others. So it becomes really complicated. But again, because we don't have that assessment framework and we're not measuring these things effectively, because again, part of the framework could include things like, well, let's look at community tensions, let's include hate crime figures, for example. You'd start to then understand a bit more and more holistically about what those factors are. So I could not give you a full conclusive picture or reason what those factors are, but I think it can be quite easily done.
It's interesting, and again, looking at the sort of the responsibility of local authorities, and certainly from my experience, I've seen with local government cuts, one of the first things that tend to get cut back is the focus on cohesion and diversity, equality and inclusion. So what's your assessment of the ability of local authorities to respond to threats to community cohesion?
I mean, I agree with you on that point. That was something that was picked up up regularly, and now obviously when we know so many local authorities are struggling financially, one of the very first things that will be cut is social cohesion efforts. And again, there's something ironic about that, because actually in times where there are crises, whether it's the cost of living crisis or other, as we saw with the pandemics, you will find bad faith actors and others seeking to exploit that anger, those grievances, even further in an attempt to undermine social cohesion. So if local authorities are then curtailing social cohesion efforts, it just worsens the situation overall. That is very much a significant concern. I think with local authorities, part of the challenge is that when you're fighting over budgets, as local authorities always are, again, when you've not been able to measure and demonstrate the cost-benefit analysis of social cohesion, which is one of the policy and delivery problems of social cohesion, if you can't demonstrate that, it's very hard to convince your council leader to spend money on social cohesion, because you can say, look, I've organised 5 programmes, we've had 50 people turn up, it's all great. But if you can't really demonstrate through objective, clear means of how it is actually improving social cohesion, you're demonstrating outcomes rather than outputs, which is what happens at present, it becomes then very difficult to convince local authorities when they've got so many other pressing issues to focus on. And so that doesn't help the problem either. But at the same time, having spoken to numerous local authorities across the country, they all recognise the importance of social cohesion. And one of the things that I've put in the recommendations is that it can't just be an add-on. It has to be something that's firmly embedded in your strategic approach, because everything you do affects social cohesion. In terms of, if you want people, if you want to improve public health, invest in social cohesion. If you want to improve people volunteering, and invest in social cohesion. If you want people to have the ability to have resilience against divisive or extremist activity, invest in, improve your social cohesion aspect. But it's got to be a fundamental part of their strategic approach, rather than a kind of, what should our social cohesion strategy look like?
Yeah. You got any examples of local authorities who are doing this really well, and what are they doing to do this well?
I would say Oldham, which is for me really fascinating, because when Ted Cantle did his review of cohesion back in 2001, following the race riots in the summer of 2001, there was clear-cut challenges with Oldham. You know, the residential ethnic segregation, high levels of deprivation and poverty, breakdown of relationships between the white communities and the Pakistani communities, and a whole range of other social cohesion concerns. When I went up to visit Oldham, I was honestly really inspired by what I saw. You know, I met the leader of the council at that time, the chief executive, lots of civil society groups, and some of the things that they do, for example, is that they've created this, it's called a Thriving Communities Index, where they're able to measure social cohesion well. They go around and they do a lot of polling, they really ascertain the views of the population that they serve. They have this scheme called, I think it's called the Doorstop Engagement Programme, where every month they go around knocking on doors of local residents. I think it's about 1,700 to 1,800 doors a month, asking people, right, what are your concerns, any grievances? And at a time when you always hear people saying, well, you know, local government doesn't engage with me, they're actively going out to make sure that their voices are being heard, to raise any issues or grievances that they've got. And that level of engagement is really fantastic, and there's lots of other examples that they demonstrated, which I thought, for me, is Oldham as an example of good practice. Now, that's not to say they don't have their challenges, and I think this is what's so fascinating about, I think, the challenges in terms of social cohesion today, because despite the fact that they're doing all this great work, they, as I outlined in the review, they are facing severe challenges around conspiracy theories, disinformation, to such an extent that it's actually inhibiting their ability to carry out their democratic mandate. You know, I was really shocked at the scale of abuse and threats that councillors and council officials are experiencing. They are, without a doubt, experiencing what I've identified as freedom-restricting harassment, which we can talk about. But the inability to respond to those conspiracy theories and disinformation is hampering all of their social cohesion efforts and is almost poisoning the area. And as a result of those conspiracy theories, they've said that they've seen far-right groups, neo-fascist groups come into the area, again, to exploit tensions. How do you deal with that? And one of their pleas to me, and I suppose to government, is you're not providing us with the guidance that we need. We don't know how to deal with these threats. We don't want to say or do anything that could worsen the situation. How do you deal with conspiracy theories that are being shared with hundreds of thousands of people? It's causing disruption in local council meetings. We don't know what to do. And that was, I have to say, that was something that came up repeatedly. We're experiencing all these challenges. We look to central government thinking there's going to be some kind of guidance and support, and there is nothing. It's not a prevent problem because it's not terrorism. Where does this threat, this type of threat, what does it fall under in terms of current government programmes? It doesn't fall under anything. And again, that was one of the findings I outline in the review, that Whitehall does not have a strategic approach to deal with this, and we're leaving local authorities to deal with a really complex and challenging problems, and which is without a doubt undermining social cohesion.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Before I bring in Catherine, I just wanted to ask, in terms of Oldham's good work, did they designate a certain amount of money and resources to that? And do you think that local authorities are funded in a way that enables that sort of work?
They do allocate a certain amount of their budget to this type of work. I can't tell you what that figure is, I can't quite remember. But from a central government perspective, the last major action plan was the 2019 Integrated Communities Action Plan, which was published in 2019 by MHCLG. They only gave funding to 5 areas. They were like 5 pilot areas. So those 5 areas received some funding. Other areas didn't. So, and then a lot of that work got disrupted through the pandemic. So there isn't any funding for local authorities to carry out. So there's no central government funding to carry out social cohesion work.
And were there any findings or learnings from that pilot, or was that just completely lost in the COVID?
So, I mean, I've reviewed that work. Yeah. I've reviewed that action plan, and I mean, you know, it was launched in 2019, just as they were getting going. The pandemic happened. I think one of the other challenges as well was also just the huge political instability, where you were having constant change of secretaries of state at MHCLG. I mean, I was there from 2001 to 2024, and I think I had 5 secretaries of state at MHCLG at that time. So that there was that political instability which caused a problem, because some ministers really, supportive of social cohesion efforts, others had absolutely zero interest in it, and that does have an impact. But local governments unfortunately don't have that support centrally. But in terms of the review, what I found was there were a lot of concerns I had around it in terms of how do you again measure these programs. How do you know they're having any impact? I spoke to all of those 5 local authorities, visited some of them as well. And again, they agreed with me, for example, that, look, in the absence of a kind of assessment framework, we don't really know whether our programs are having an impact. We can, again, say outputs, but we can't necessarily say outcomes. So if I would say, for example, as I did, look, you're receiving funding for English language, for learning English language, when those women, and it's predominantly women who've come off those courses, what happens to them? You've got a challenge around high levels of unemployment. Are you tracking, for example, if some of those people are learning English, they are then progressing on, whether it's in going into employment or further education or volunteering even, and they're saying we're not really tracking that. And I think that, again, to me is a kind of short-sightedness. But again, I don't think the action plan ever really wanted to look at that. And again, one of the problems with the action plan was it was this very kind of, all we're interested in is bums on seats type programs, as opposed to saying, well, actually what we need to do is audience segmentation. There are all kinds of different people who have all kinds of different views and opinions. How do you create bespoke programs for different audiences? You can't just go, let's all have a program together, and despite all our very diverse views and opinions and grievances, we're all going to sit together and have a nice cup of tea and think the world is wonderful. It's just not going to work. But again, there was that kind of mentality, which to a certain degree, I think Louise Casey raised in her 2016 review, where she said, you have these, what did she say? She said something like, where you have these integration programs of sari, samosas and steel drums for the well-intended and the well-intentioned. And I did feel like, 6 years on after having done my review from hers, there was still that kind of sense of, let's sit down and talk about the things we agree on, rather than actually really getting down to the nitty-gritty of where do we disagree on? Because inevitably, when you live in a diverse democracy, tensions are inevitable. You will have conflicts. The role of social cohesion is then to address how then do you overcome those tensions, that we are able to live well together and celebrate our plural democracy. So for me, the action plan didn't address a lot of the things. I mean, it certainly didn't address threats to social cohesion. Again, leaving local authorities in the dark about how do you address these contemporary threats that we are having to deal with on a day-to-day basis.
Thank you. Catherine?
Yeah, I wanted to take you back to the, just briefly about what factors can make some areas more prone to unrest and the riots that we saw in the summer than others, because in Wales I'm a Welsh MP, we didn't have any riots in Wales. Obviously, I'm really pleased about that. But do we know if there's any reason for that?
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating because, I mean, I was speaking to colleagues in Luton, and, we had this discussion, and I don't know, Chair, whether you've got views on this, but again, it was this idea of, well, maybe Luton will have riots because there's been a long-standing concern around Islamist and far-right extremism in the area, but Luton didn't have riots. And I know that they do a lot of good work around social cohesion and bringing different communities together, and I do think that does play a very important role, actually. But it's very hard to for me to definitely tell you what those factors are. I mean, and also, look, I was speaking to some of the senior police officers from Birmingham who were saying, look, we didn't have any major riots during the summer either. But then I pointed out to them, yes, but do you remember the Leicester riots? Some of that between the Hindu and Muslim communities back in September 2022, some of that did happen in Birmingham. So again, and for me, that is a social cohesion challenge as well, where you've got a breakdown of relationship between Hindu and Muslim communities, which started in Leicester, but it did happen in Birmingham. So how can what's the reasoning around that then? You didn't have riots during the summer, but you did have disturbances and clashes and violence when it came to, a breakdown of relationship between Muslim and Hindu communities. So again, you could measure social cohesion in one way, but then you could measure it another way, and it shows that actually it has broken down in a particular and amongst a particular group of people. But again, this is where we need to do so much more research around those factors. I mean, instinctively, my view would be if you have areas that have high levels of trust and engagement with local government, if people feel that they're being listened to, if you're doing and running programs where people don't hold suspicion of each other and are able to, and are mixing with each other, if you do address those kind of wider grievances and concerns, I think those kind of factors are important. And you're able to measure resilience. How do you measure societal resilience to some of these issues? I think that's really important as well. So it's about understanding the factors, but it's also measuring that level of resilience that people have in an area as well, which again we're not doing enough of, and the National Resilience Framework certainly does not measure that at present.
Thank you, Catherine. Yes, it didn't happen in Luton. It is obviously an area where I think people would focus their attention, given who the clashes were in the summer riots. But it wasn't an accident that it didn't happen in Luton, and I think we need to explore places where we think it could have happened and it didn't, and the reasons for that, because there's a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes to ensure it doesn't.
I mean, I completely agree with you on that, Chair. One thing I would say is that the 5 areas that received funding through the Integrated Community Action Plan, the Belong Network, did a piece of research during the pandemic where they showed that those areas that had invested in social cohesion, they fared much better than other areas that didn't invest in social cohesion, and they found that those 5 areas did have higher levels of trust with local and national government. There were higher levels of volunteering. There were higher levels of civic engagement. So that was a very important piece of research that actually demonstrated that when you do invest in social cohesion, the outcomes are positive, and that there is data that demonstrates that.
I'm curious.
I just wanted to ask, you've mentioned or you referred to social cohesion a lot. Is there a difference between social cohesion and community cohesion, or is there a reason for using that term over the other?
So, I mean, this has been a debate over the last 20 years. I think some of this is academic jargon, if I'm honest, because I think a lot of people that use the phrase community cohesion, they're actually talking about social cohesion. Yeah. I mean, I think for me, when we talk about community cohesion, I think that's much more at a local level, I would suggest. But for me, when I was doing the review, I wanted to talk about social cohesion in a much more broader sense. And my review focused very much on, it took on the work of the academics, Botany from 2018, and there's Chan, his work from 2016, where they talk about the interactions at a horizontal and a vertical level. And by that I mean, at a horizontal level, our interactions between individuals, between different groups, different communities, intra-group relationships as well. But also at a vertical level, so the relationship between the state and individuals. And I think that, for me, is looking at social cohesion is slightly broader, because I think community cohesion, you can end up just looking at a very narrow set of things where it is just the relationship perhaps between different groups of people at a local level. So I personally prefer social cohesion. I think it's a much more broader and helpful use of language in talking about it. But what I would say is that the government doesn't have an agreed definition of social cohesion, and that was one of the challenges that I found, because when I was going around speaking to practitioners and local authorities, I asked them, well, what do you understand by social cohesion? They'd give me very different answers and views, where some would go really, really broad, and then some would go really, really narrow. And that's also part of the problem from a policy perspective, because if everyone's got a slightly different view on what they understand to be social cohesion, how are you going to measure it either as well? Because you've all got a slightly different view. And so you need that kind of consensus, I think, from government saying this is what we understand by social cohesion, and this is therefore how we're going to measure it.
That's really helpful, thank you.
Thank you, that is really helpful. Samantha.
You've mentioned contemporary threats, and so this sort of quite naturally brings us on to what extent is the dissemination of misinformation and conspiracy theories a threat to community, social cohesion and civic engagement?
Oh, where to start? It's a really huge threat. Look, conspiracy theories, disinformation isn't anything new. I think we all know that. But the challenge is the scale, the speed that disinformation and those conspiracies spread, I mean, it's just unprecedented, and the reach of people. So, I mean, just taking the summer riots as an example, 2 hours after the horrific murders that we saw in Southport, one Twitter X channel, they started putting out a whole load of disinformation saying, look, the attacker is an illegal immigrant, which was clearly not true. That single tweet alone had 4 million impressions. Within 6 hours, on Telegram, another channel called Southport Wake Up amassed 14,000 followers. Again, spreading disinformation, spreading conspiracy theories. And again, they were sharing addresses of asylum, of hotels where asylum seekers were staying, locations of mosques, and also putting out guides on how to carry out arson attacks. We also saw the spread of disinformation internationally. There were international activists online spreading that disinformation, as well as domestic actors. And a lot of this is also happening offline as well. It's not just happening online. But it's the scale and speed of that is really, really concerning. And it is designed to undermine social cohesion in a way that is really incredibly frightening. And so, again, all of the local areas that I spoke to, like I said earlier, they all raised their concerns around conspiracy theories, around disinformation, were able to demonstrate quite clearly the real-world harm or the offline harm it was having. Because sometimes there's this kind of narrative out there where we think, oh, well, if it's online, it doesn't have any real-world harm, when it does. That view has to be completely dismantled, because it's just nonsense. It clearly does have real-world harm. And again, if you look at the data around conspiracy theories, people who subscribe to it are more likely to have distrust of government. It then becomes a kind of cycle where, again, the more you believe in those conspiracy theories, many of which are anti-establishment and promoting distrust, it makes you further believe in that. So it's a real challenge. And, to be very frank, when I was speaking to senior officials, they said the government does not know how to respond to conspiracy theories and disinformation. So then when local authorities are saying, well, what are we supposed to do? We don't know how to deal with it. It's a real challenge.
So that actually quite nicely leads me on to a little bit of a supplementary question to that then, and you may or may not have the answer, because I think if we had it would feel like a silver bullet. But what strategies can be employed to dismantle online echo chambers that actually propagate the extremist beliefs to de-radicalise individuals drawn into them? So we're seeing this thing sucking people that want to believe that. So how can we intercept? How can we?
Well, that's become a lot harder now that Facebook, as one platform, has got rid of its fact checkers, and where Mark Zuckerberg openly said that is going to result in more bad stuff happening. So I think that's become even more challenging, actually. There is some research that's happening at looking at how do you employ counter narratives as a way to challenge online disinformation and conspiracy theories. There's research looking at, well, who is the right messenger? So, for example, I think there's quite a big consensus of, look, if government starts putting out counter narratives, that they are probably not the right messenger, because people are going to say, well, it's the government, isn't it? Who else? Why should we trust anything they say? So again, ensuring you have the right messenger is quite important. There's some good research around media literacy, in ensuring they're able to counter conspiracy theories and disinformation. The issue of media, though, is really challenging, because local media journalism has just been dismantled completely now. And actually a lot of the research showed that local journalism was really important in countering disinformation and conspiracy theories, and helping people to engage and hold local officials to account, for example, and to report on what's happening in court cases in an open way. I mean, that's just been decimated now at a local level. So there's concerns there. So that those kinds of programs, obviously educational programs within schools, that's really important, teaching children critical thinking skills. But I think if you're asking me specifically about the wider online challenge, I think we're going to have to think much more radically about how we tackle that. But I have seen some really promising work around looking at promoting counter narratives online. But the challenge is that how do you get Western governments to start thinking about addressing this in a way that is meaningful, because at the moment it's just not really happening. There is no kind of strategic policy to deal with that. Because again, it'd be great to see the Online Safety Act and Ofcom holding the social media platforms to account, but I think they are going to struggle with disinformation and misinformation quite significantly. And I don't know how much Ofcom will be able to challenge some of that, if I'm being honest.
No, it's fine. I think we'll all scratch our heads too. But hopefully brilliant minds will come up with an answer, because I think we've got to find one. But on a slightly different topic, but very much related, do you think the rise of incel culture and misogynistic influences is having an impact on communities?
I'm glad you asked that question, because we've got to be under no illusion that the incel subculture and the male supremacist mindset has been growing for a number of years. I wrote, when I was the Commissioner for Countering Extremism, I wrote a report 4 years ago highlighting my concern about incel extremism, and I used the E word very deliberately, because this is where there's so much information available online where incel activists are spreading the most awful propaganda online about how it is justified to rape, murder, kill women. This is I'm not talking about, I hate this phrase, but everyday sexism. I am talking about horrendous acts of violence and justifying rape and violence against women. There was the Centre for Countering Digital Hate. They did a really good report where they looked at just one popular incel forum and found that 29 minutes was the average time the issue of rape was discussed, and this was a forum that had 17,000 members. We know that more and more young men in this country, unfortunately, particularly in the age brackets between 16 to 24, are increasingly subscribing to male supremacist views. I think it's something like 45% of young men have a very positive view of Andrew Tate between the ages of 16 to 24. And just before Christmas last year, I spoke to a number of senior counter-terrorism and policing experts from some of the Five Eyes countries who said that, and they all raised their concerns about the growing threat of incel extremism. All of them. I remember speaking to one woman who'd been a senior police officer for about 40 years, and she said when she started in the police back in the 1980s, obviously there was a certain level of misogyny in everyday life that she experienced. She said what she sees today is on a scale she's never seen before in terms of the absolute violence justified against women, and that they're seeing more and more young men supporting those views. It's incredibly concerning. And again, whether the Home Office views incel as extremism or not, I think is something they need to clarify, but it's certainly something I wrote about 4 years ago and argued that it should be dealt with as part of any counter-extremism or counter-terrorism strategy.
Thank you. My last question is what is your assessment of the effectiveness of Prevent in tackling extremism? And just to sort of go a bit further on that, in what ways can Prevent be improved to be more effective in preventing the radicalisation of young people? So
I think it's really important that we understand what Prevent is and what Prevent isn't, because there's a lot of confusion about Prevent. Prevent is part of the government's counter-terrorism strategy. It's often reported as being part of counter-extremism efforts. It isn't. It's part of the government's counter-terrorism strategy, which is very different to having a counter-extremism approach. So we did have a counter-extremism strategy separate to Prevent. Back in 2015, when David Cameron was Prime Minister, he launched the first ever CE strategy, which basically dealt with extremism that fell below the terrorism threshold. So Contest, which is the government's counter-terrorism strategy and includes Prevent, deals with terrorism, but where extremism fell below the terrorism threshold, that's where the counter-extremism strategy came in. That strategy was then scrapped by the government in 2021. So right now there is no counter-extremism strategy to deal with extremism that falls below the terrorism threshold. So that can include, by the way, far-right extremists. It can include Islamist extremists. In one of my previous reports, I wrote about organisations like Combat 18, which is a neo-Nazi organisation, that talks about weeding out Jews from government, that talks about the final solution as part of its founding aims, all kinds of horrific things where you have neo-Nazi organisations promoting the same ideology, same narratives, same conspiracy theories as prescribed neo-Nazi groups, but because they don't encourage terrorism, they are lawful in this country and they are able to propagate their propaganda, recruit young people to their cause, radicalise young people. So it's really important to understand thresholds, first and foremost. So below the terrorism prevent threshold, you have a massive challenge of hateful extremism, again, which there is no framework, we don't know the scale of it, there is no strategy to deal with it. It's a massive problem. On the issue of prevent, I mean, there are a number of challenges with it. One of the things I'm most concerned about, and you raised it, is youth radicalisation. I mean, for Ken McCallum, the Director General of MI5, to say in October that in the last 3 years alone, we've seen a threefold increase of young people under the age of 18 being investigated for terrorism is shocking. And this is despite the fact that since 2015, so the last 10 years, we've had the prevent duty, where the government has been actively working with schools, the Department of Education has been working with schools to teach British values, to have this duty to report young people if they're being radicalised. You've got all of that extensive work happening, yet despite that, you're seeing a massive rise in youth radicalisation. So the question to the Home Office effectively is, well, why has this happened? When you're meant to be, your whole job, is, as it says on the tin, is to prevent this from happening. But the figures are showing something quite different. So that is something that I'm quite concerned about in relation to prevent's efficacy. The other concern, of course, which has been discussed a lot in the press, and I don't know how much you want me to go into this, is when people have been referred to prevent. Like the Southport murderer, like Callum Parslow, who neo-Nazi who was convicted for carrying out an attempted stabbing of an asylum seeker, but who also had a history of stalking women and girls and was convicted for that. These were individuals who had been referred to prevent, but didn't get through into the channel. They didn't receive in-channel support, so they in effect fell through the net. And because there is no other system in place to deal with those individuals, they're just allowed to wander around on our streets and to do what they want to do.
Did they fall through the net because it's not terrorism, it's extremism?
So it fell through the net because it didn't meet the very high threshold of terrorism, which is what it needs to be for a referral. And again, if you look at the definition of radicalisation that the Home Office uses, it's a very narrow definition where they say people where they are interested in the use of terrorist violence. So it's not extremist violence, it's terrorist violence. So they fell through the gap because they didn't meet that very high threshold. So even if you hold views around mass violence views, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to, if it's not a terrorism concern, it doesn't mean you'll necessarily get channel support. Because there is no other counter-extremism approach, they will just fall through the nets. I mean, I remember when I was at the Commission, I had constant numbers of schools saying to me, we've got so many young kids who are displaying extremist views, we've referred them to prevent, but because it's not meeting the high threshold for terrorism, the Home Office said, I'm sorry, there's nothing that we can do. But then you know that this is the case, so what are you going to do about it? And then we seem surprised that now we're hearing that there's a threefold increase in the last 3 years of youth radicalisation. So, I mean, there's a whole range of problems, I think, with prevent, which we could spend all day talking about, but those are some of my biggest concerns about it.
I'm just going to ask a quick question about prevent specifically and then come to David. When it comes to those thresholds, would you say that they are not at the right level at the moment to be effective? And are there certain groups of young people that are being targeted more than others because of the threshold?
So, I mean, answering your second question first, it just cuts across the board. I mean, I see young people being radicalised from all kinds of different groups. I see neo-fascist groups specifically targeting young people. I see Islamist groups in this country deliberately targeting young people and seeking to radicalise them. And then obviously you have young people growing up who are just being exposed to violence online. I mean, there was a poll that showed 73% of, again, 16 to 24-year-olds have all viewed terrorist or extremist or extreme violent content online. This is becoming, unfortunately, part of their norm. So you're seeing this, and then where young people are now, there's almost a thirst for violence, not necessarily even terrorism, but a thirst for violence where they are self-radicalising in their own bedrooms. So it cuts across the board, but I think it's really important to understand that extremists have always targeted young people. You know, it's a key part of their tactic. They've always done this, because how do you make sure that your message continues down through the generations? They always target young people. So that's something that's particularly, is important to bear in mind. On the issue of, I can't quite remember the question of thresholds.
Whether the thresholds are in the right place, basically. Are they too high currently to be effective for Prevent?
So again, it depends what threat you're talking about that you're wanting to address, and what thresholds you're there for, and which thresholds. So for example, I'll give you an example. I always hear the Security Minister, as he said last Tuesday in the House of Commons, that the Islamist threat is the greatest threat in this country. Now, my first question to him would be, but which threat are you talking about? If you're talking about the terrorist threat, absolutely right. There's no doubt. MI5 have made it clear that around 70 to 75% of their workload is dealing with the Islamist terrorist threat. But if you're asking me if the threat from the what I call hateful extremist threat, we don't know what that threat picture looks like, because no one's collected data on it, which is something that I've argued for a long time. My view is I don't think it would be the Islamist extremism challenge just in terms of demographics. I think Muslims make up something like 3.5-4% of the population. I think there is a real significant far-right hateful extremism threat that we're not dealing with effectively, and then a whole range of other challenges as well. So again, it depends which threat you're talking about, because once you understand what threat you're talking about, then you can start talking about thresholds. And again, if you want to deal with extremism that falls below the terrorism threshold, where, again, evidence has shown a lot of these extremist groups are not engaged in terrorism, but what other harms are they causing? Well, they are contributing to an erosion of social cohesion. They are actively promoting the denigration of certain groups of people they despise, whether it's women, whether it's gay people, whether it's certain Muslims or Jews, for example. That's a completely different challenge. We know that in some cases extremism contributes to a rise in hate crime, but we don't know the scale of that. So it depends what the threat picture you're looking at and then where the thresholds are. I think with Prevent, it should probably be focused on dealing with terrorism, but then there is a question of, well, what do you do around dealing with Rudy Cabana, for example, other individuals who may not necessarily hold an ideological viewpoint, which has always been a fundamental part in describing terrorism, but have some other kind of extreme or mass violence. And my own view is that I think the channel scheme should be broadened to capture all of these different types of people. Extremists that fall below the terrorism threshold that need intervention and support, individuals who have some, perverse fascination with mass violence, and also terrorism concerns. And I think what you should do is broaden channel, then have a triage system, where then you funnel them through the right scheme, where CT policing will then deal with those individuals who've got terrorism concerns and so forth, because they will require different approaches. So I think channel needs to be expanded. Whether it should be part of Prevent is another question, because again, if Prevent is about counter-terrorism, it feels like to me you need to create a separate safeguarding scheme that deals with all of these other issues, and then that ensures no one's falling through the gap.
I'm really glad that you used the phrase safeguarding schemes in there, because these are children,
yes.
And as you say, they are being targeted, and I think it is really shocking to hear that there are certain groups that are just completely falling through the net in that, David.
Yeah, I think you've literally just answered my question. We've got a statement in the chamber at the moment, yes, where we're literally talking about, there's a case close to my heart in Sir David Amos, who was the MP before me in Southend, and they're announcing a review of the learning review from his case, because Prevent failed there. And my question was going to be, what would be your recommendation to government, because Prevent is failing far too much, and the consequences to families are absolutely devastating when it does fail.
I mean, in addition to what I've said, I would also say you can't expect a counter-terrorism strategy to fix what are also societal problems. People don't wake up one morning and then decide they're going to carry out acts of terrorism. It's not happens. You know, you need to ensure, and I've always seen it as, look, there's three related areas. You've got counter-terrorism work, you've got counter-extremism work, and you have social cohesion work, and they're all joined up. I mean, I remember when I was at the Commission, I used to have a lot of meetings with people inside the security intelligences or with counter-terrorism policing, and they would always talk to me, funnily enough, about social cohesion. They wouldn't actually talk to me about terrorism. They would talk to me about social cohesion because they, from an operational perspective, understood how and why social cohesion matters, in that it is literally prevent social cohesion. It is that early intervention work where you're building resilience, where you're addressing concerns that people may have, whether they do hold extreme views about women or about other groups of people. You've got to build that social cohesion approach, and you also have to have a counter-extremism approach, and they can't be siloed off either, because often they are. You must have a much more greater joined-up approach, which again is just one of the problems inside Whitehall. Again, everything is kind of disjointed. You know, the Home Office might do a counter-extremism strategy, MHCLD might do a cohesion strategy, but it's just done in a disjointed way. And sometimes I feel over the last couple of years, successive governments have just been so focused on prevent and counter-terrorism without just stepping back and saying, hang on a minute, we also have to bolster our social cohesion effort. We also have to ensure that we have an effective approach dealing with counter-extremism more broadly, to ensure that we are able to live together well and deal with those tensions that inevitably are going to emerge.
Thank you. Rachel.
Thank you. Apologies that I was late to this inquiry, and thank you for your time. How do you think public figures, such as politicians, can best use their platforms to promote social cohesion?
This has been an issue that has been raised consistently in terms of the last 20 years' worth of reports, and it was something, again, that I raised in my review, because it was an issue that was raised all the time when I went up and down the country. I don't need to say to you here that politicians have the ability to bring people together, but equally at the same time they have the ability to divide people. They have the ability to use language that is, again, brings people together. They have the ability to use language that divides and polarizes people. That is the reality. And at the end of my review, I kind of came to the view that there is an inherently uneasy and difficult relationship between politicians and social cohesion. It's not easy to talk about it, but it is the case where, I saw with my own eyes examples of fantastic efforts by members of parliaments, local councillors, who were willing to stand up, address bad faith actors in their area, or even extremists or certain community leaders that have no interest in social cohesion, were willing to stand up and say, no, that's not acceptable, that's not right, even if it meant that they were going to experience abuse and backlash, which they did. And I was really impressed and recognised how difficult that was. But at the same time, I also saw examples of parliamentarians, councillors and others who were just in complete denial. Or they were more concerned about their winning the votes of their constituents, particularly as you're heading towards a general election. I'm the first to say that does put members of parliament in a really difficult situation. But from a social cohesion perspective, how do you tackle that? It's a real difficult challenge, and I don't know whether I have the answers to that. I mean, you only need to look at statistics now around how the British public, they are increasingly losing trust in politicians. They feel that politicians are using culture wars to deliberately divide and politicise issues in a way that isn't helpful. And leadership really matters. I think at the heart of social cohesion, a lot of this is about leadership. If people aren't willing to stand up and challenge extreme views or really insightful, hateful views, believe you me, from what I've seen over the years, is extremists will come and fill that void and spread their own narratives and exploit local tensions. So that leadership is really important. But it's a very, I don't necessarily have the answer to that. I mean, I spoke to a whole range of different people, but it is a challenge, and there's something about how do you hold politicians to account. I suspect it's more to do at a local level where constituents are much more engaged and they're able to hold their politicians to account, where their ability to engage, and there's more, I'd like to see more cohesion panels where parliamentarians and councils are able to be held to account. I think things like that are really important, but it is a real difficult challenge, because I've seen firsthand how members of parliament and even cabinet ministers have used language and behaved in a way that has absolutely legitimised the language of extremists.
And I think we've seen a sort of increase in those deliberate culture wars entered into by politicians, whether that's targeted at certain communities or at trans people. Do you think that directly leads to hate crime?
I mean, I've been to certain parts of the country where local police forces have told me that, and they've seen a correlation between the language that politicians have used and then literally a few days later the particular target group that the politicians have been talking about has resulted in a rise in hate crime against them. So some of the statistics demonstrate that themselves. So there is a correlation.
How do you think that the government should respond to those prominent figures using their social media platforms to purposefully destabilise social cohesion or destabilise sort of community relations in this country?
So I think it's very important that political parties themselves have rules around this about how they expect their candidates, their members of parliament to behave. I think that's really what they set a very clear standard. I mean, there are obviously seven principles of, seven Nolan principles. I've always kind of thought that should there be an eighth around that, politicians should be ensuring that they're upholding democratic rights and freedoms, which includes obviously non-discrimination, ensuring that you don't undermine the rights and freedoms of other people or engage in language that does that, but in a way that doesn't curtail legitimate freedom of expression. But again, the Committee on Standards and Public Life, they've written extensively and put forward a number of recommendations to the government, which were rejected by the government about looking at some of these issues. So again, I would say go back to those previous reports and implement some of those recommendations, because it does feel like to me that political discourse has over the last couple of years become coarser and is getting worse. And I think all that does actually is just feeds into this kind of anger and distrust towards politicians that the public hold. It doesn't do democracy any favours. It just further feeds this cycle of, well, we don't trust them. Well, they're all the same, or they speak in a certain way, and if they can behave in that way, well, why can't we? So it's really kind of just, it's very easy for someone to say something. Yes, it might be a short-term gain, but in the long term, you're just undermining and harming democracy itself.
Thank you.
Thank you. I just wanted to dig a little bit further on that, if I can, because there are elements within the political mainstream now that we work alongside that would pride themselves on having to be held to those principles and not meeting them, because as you said, it is this, they feed off a mistrust that people have of government and democracy at the moment, and it is how you get that balance right. I think if it is left up to parties, that possibly we don't have any input in that. There isn't a say on that.
Yes. How
do we make sure that there is some independence held up to that? The ICGS is very much about complaints of behaviour rather than standards of conduct, really, in protecting democracy. Is there a space for something like that, you see?
I think there probably has to be. And again, I genuinely struggle. I don't have an answer. I mean, I think it requires a lot of thinking around this, where politicians are held to account for what they do and don't do, particularly when it's about denigrating a particular group of people or the language that they are using. And the challenge is sometimes it's very hard to prove. So if somebody says something about one particular ethnic group, you may not see the consequences of that in maybe 5-6 months' time, where somebody maybe was inspired what that particular individual said and then decided to go and stab somebody. It's really hard to kind of prove correlation or causation even. So it's very difficult, and that's why I think it's just so complicated. But I do think, having spoken to the former chair of the Committee on Standards and Public Life, this was something that certainly concerned him, and it just feels to me that more needs to be looked at this, and I think it's a matter of priority, because again, as I have done when I've seen politicians almost engage in conspiratorial narratives, arguing that there are cover-ups, again, all you're doing is just undermining democracy, feeding this distrust. It might be a short political gain for you, but in the long, like I said, it's you're just feeding into this really dangerous wider climate of distrust and disillusionment with democracy. That is really concerning. And just another point I would make is that, obviously I talked about leadership, but I think one of the difficulties now than, say, even when Louise Casey wrote her review back in 2016 is that this climate of freedom restricting harassment I've spoken about, where nobody wants to put themselves out there knowing they're going to get death threats and abuse. And I spoke to a number of parliamentarians who said, look, if I say the right thing and do the right thing, I am going to be hounded and get loads of death threats. I spoke to counsellors, for example, who told me that, she receives thousands of death threats. One told me that she makes her 2-year-old daughter sleep by a fireproof blanket because that's the state of discourse in our country today. And again, so I have a lot of sympathy with that. If parliamentarians want to do the right thing, even if they, clearly want to say the right thing in terms of upholding social cohesion, the climate in our country today makes it very difficult for you to do that, because at what cost are we expecting parliamentarians and others in public life to bear? For me, that's why I spent a lot of time talking about freedom restricting harassment in the report, because I could see how it is poisoning the lifeblood of our democracy.
Have you had any involvement with the Modernisation Committee at all? And have you been invited in to give your views on this?
No.
Okay. Might be a good recommendation.
Yeah.
Coming to Kirith now. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. You've talked a little bit about thresholds, particularly around extremism and the PREVENT programme. I wanted to know what your assessment is of the current definition of extremism.
So the 2024 definition of extremism, which was published, I think, March last year. So it's definitely better than the 2015 definition, which, I did a public consultation in 2019 where I asked the public their views about the old definition, and there was not support for it at all. I think it was something like 75% of people did not find the then 2015 definition helpful, and it was certainly not helpful from an operational perspective. It was great for a politician to stand behind a lectern and say, extremism is, X, Y, Z, but actually from an operational perspective, it wasn't helpful. I think the new definition that the previous government put forward is much better. It's much tighter. Again, it's not had the chance to be implemented properly in the way, because obviously we had the general election. But it's really important to ask the question, look, what is the purpose of a definition ultimately? You've got a definition now. What did the then government plan to use it for? And I don't think that thing had necessarily been developed yet, or there was thinking, but it was not made public. So again, it's a lot better. I think it tries to show that you can protect freedom of expression, but how that would be used, that's just a small part of a wider counter-extremism approach that is needed.
Yeah. Thank you. And how important do you think it is for the government to commit to defining Islamophobia or anti-Muslim hatred and prejudice?
Again, I suppose it goes back to this point of, well, what is the purpose of defining it? My view is that, look, having clarity about what is and what isn't anti-Muslim hatred, I think, is important. Because I do believe we are seeing a normalisation of anti-Muslim hatred attitudes in this country over the years, at all different age ranges. I think it's really concerning. You only need to just step online to see how horrendous and awful it is, including the levels of abuse that Muslims in public life and others experience. But again, it kind of boils down to what is the purpose of it. I think it is important to clarify what is and what isn't, because I've seen how, including politicians, use anti-Muslim tropes, very blatant, very obvious, tick, 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 those are definitely anti-Muslim tropes you've used, and then go, oh, it's not anti-Muslim, when it clearly is. So there's a confusion around that. But at the same time, I've also seen others who will exploit the language of Islamophobia to shut down legitimate debate. So, where people will argue that, oh, look, if we want to talk about, say, Islamist extremism, or you can't talk about that because you're an Islamophobe. Talking and countering Islamist extremism is a legitimate policy area. And so, that's really, you can see how it gets used and abused. I mean, I'm from a Muslim background. I've done work speaking about countering Islamist extremism. I've lost count the number of times I've been labelled an Islamophobe, ironically. So again, this discussion is very, very important. But I think, just to be very clear, we can't fall under this pretense that by having some kind of definition all the problems are going to be fixed. I mean, if you look at the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which we've had for a good couple of years now, that's been adopted by a lot of universities and institutions and local authorities, the scale of anti-Semitism now is really concerning. So just having a definition is not going to fix the problem. But I think being able to clarify what is and what isn't anti-Muslim hatred is definitely needed.
Thank you, Karen. I just wanted a quick question about the response to the summer riots. Have you met with the new government to discuss your review and to discuss what happened during the summer riots at all? No. Okay. Is that planned for the future at all?
So I've not been contacted by any senior officials or any minister from MHCLG to discuss the review.
Thank you very much. Alex?
Thank you. I wanted to ask how good you think the government is at identifying and mitigating potential risks to community cohesion.
Not good at all, I think. I think the summer riots highlighted that very clearly. I, for one, was not shocked at all by those by the riots that we saw over the summer. I mean, I've written, and some of the case studies I used were for the review, but even in previous reports where places like Sunderland, Barrow in Furness, other places where tensions have emerged for whatever reason. There's been a whole range of disturbances, protests. You've seen disinformation being propagated. You've seen the involvement of extremist actors. And, these are kind of smaller but very similar case examples that we've seen happen across the country for a number of years. So the fact that Whitehall was in effect on the back foot of the summer riots just showed you that they did not have an early warning system where they should have to have monitored and picked up on these tensions and done something about it. And even earlier, that kind of preventative work to really identify those challenges and put that work, in a much more earlier stage. So that system is not there. So they aren't very good at detecting early warning signs, and by now they really should have developed it. From my perspective, it's just unacceptable that they've not developed an approach where they quite easily could do that, but they haven't done that, and that's why now they're on the back foot, I'm afraid.
So do you think mechanisms such as the National Resilience Framework, the National Risk Register, Defending Democracy Task Force, do you think they can be utilised to help identify and address threats to community cohesion?
It's a difficult question because my instinct is that's where you'd think it should sit because you've got that infrastructure inside Whitehall and inside Cabinet Office. But to me, if you look at the National Risk Register, I noticed that the government updated and published the latest version in January. The risks that they look at are again at a particular threshold. So the risks that they look at are, for example, all of which are incredibly important: threats to cybersecurity threats. They'll talk about terrorism, foreign state interference, for example, threats to infrastructure. All of these things are really, really important. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done at that level. So that's the level that they're looking at. But these kinds of threats to social cohesion, even if it's being done by foreign state actors, which often they are, that won't be addressed by the National Risk Register or the National Resilience Framework. If you've got threats in terms of to our democratic way of life, so threats to our institutions or to, you're seeing a decline in democratic resilience in our country and a weakening of democratic resilience, that's not addressed by the National Resilience Framework or by the Defending Democracy Task Force, because again, they have a very narrow remit of looking at foreign interference to parliamentary elections and so forth. So then it doesn't get caught by that. But then I kind of think that's probably right, because their threshold is high. What I think needs to happen is you probably need to now develop a similar framework sitting inside Cabinet Office, but whose remit is to look at strengthening social cohesion, pushing back against contemporary social threats like conspiracy theories, disinformation, building democratic resilience, which we know is worsening, because that's a different problem to dealing with the challenges that the National Security Secretariat are dealing with. But we don't have that. And, you know, when I spoke to the National Security Secretariat and the Cabinet Office, they were saying, look, we don't deal with it because we believe and we assume the Home Office and MHCLG are dealing with it. But then when I looked at their work, they weren't dealing with it. So it's a clear gap in the system.
So is that the gap then that you think could be filled with an Office of Social Cohesion and Democratic Resilience that you've talked about before? Is that where you see that fitting in?
I think it could be done two ways. I think you either you outsource it to an independent body, like this OSCDR that I suggested, or if government isn't keen on that, like I said, they could build an approach and a directorate inside Cabinet Office they build up this kind of comprehensive assessment framework and analytical capability. So there are two options, I think. But something has to be done. The current status quo is just untenable.
Thank you. First of all, apologies for being late. You've talked about the need for a social cohesion and democratic resilience body and strategy and action plan. Have you had any indication at all as to whether such a strategy is forthcoming or is being considered?
So, I mean, I've not had any response to my review, and as I said earlier, I've not had any meetings. So I'm a bit in the dark. I have heard that MHCLG are working on a cohesion strategy of some kind. How broad, how narrow it is, I have no idea. That's a question you have to put to them, I'm afraid.
What would you say has been the sort of key aspects of a strategy if it is forthcoming?
So I guess it's what I've outlined in the report, you know, where I said, look, they should have three main objectives. This kind of promote and protect social cohesion, active attempts to promote it, protect democratic freedoms when they're under threat, to identify, preempt and prevent threats of social cohesion, which is seeking to erode and undermine social cohesion, and then to respond and recover and to repair relationships as well. So I put forward 7 priorities, which kind of talked about it, so quite encompassing. And that's what I'd hope to see. I mean, I think, you know, there's obviously a certain amount of work that needs to be looking at in terms of regeneration, for example, housing. All of these bread and butter issues of social cohesion are really, really important. And I think work is being done looking on things around that, which I suppose was what part of the levelling up strategy approach was. That's very, very important because they're all kind of linked. So for me, it's where you're looking at that kind of wider improving socioeconomic factors, regeneration, all of these important factors, looking at how you improve social cohesion more generally between groups of people and improving democratic resilience, but also having to deal with threats. Because the challenge we have is that even if you do all this fantastic, great social cohesion work, if you're not dealing with the threats, your work can just go to pass. You know, as I saw firsthand in my visits across the country, that those threats are so serious, like with Oldham even, you can put all that great effort in, but it comes to a point where it's just not having the desired effect because those threats are posing such a serious risk and danger in undermining social cohesion as a whole.
To what extent, from everything that you're saying, that I'm hearing, we're not recognising, or even if we are aware of where social cohesion is breaking down and the problems, we're not recognising, if you like, our own role in that, and politicians are continuing to undermine democracy by not just the culture wars, but by the way we speak to each other and the attitudes we take. In some ways, are we actually making the situation worse?
And politicians are making it worse.
Yeah.
Quite difficult to answer that question in a room full of people.
It's all right, we're used to it. Yeah.
I mean, I think the answer to that is yes, and I'm quite open about that in the review, and I'm certainly not the first to have said that, and I definitely won't be the last. So it is, and I suppose it comes back to this question of how do you hold politicians to account. But it feels like to me it's one of those things where we do take our democracy for granted. You know, it's a precious asset, and it's also very fragile. And you know, constant vigilance over protecting our plural democracy. You know, you need that constant vigilance in ensuring that we can protect it. And it feels like to me we do take it for granted. And I don't think you can ever, particularly now in this day and age, take it for granted. It's something that does require protection, and the role of politicians is absolutely crucial in that regard. And I think really I think there needs to be much more public discourse and political discourse about this chronic trend of democratic decline in our country, and what is our country going to look like in 5-10 years' time? Because I mean, to be honest, it's one of the things that genuinely gives me sleepless nights, because I really worry about the state of our country. The fact that you look at the global trends that we're seeing, global migration's not going to go away anytime soon because of the global instability we're seeing, and yet that's a massive concern for people in this country. Obviously, the economic crisis, these things aren't going to go away, and yet everything is on a downward trend in terms of disillusionment with democracy and distrust. And one of the things that struck me after the summer riots was how we reached a point where we were discussing whether we need to get the army out onto the streets. And I know it's a broad jump to make, but for me there comes a point where if that social contract breaks down, if no one trusts or believes or listens to the organs of state, the ability for the government to control and run the country. And I know it seems quite far-fetched and people may be laughing at me, but it becomes, it becomes a challenge and it becomes difficult. And I think that's something we need to have much more greater public debate and a political debate about. Thank you.
Thank you. Basically summed up why we are holding this inquiry, so thank you.
Yeah.
Catherine.
Yeah, I know there's no silver bullet, Sara.
I wish there was.
Yeah, if there was, we'd all have done it, wouldn't we? And there obviously isn't, but you mentioned democratic decline several times and mistrust. What do you think about votes for 16 and 17-year-olds, and do you think that could help? In Wales, it's something we've done in the last few years. We've extended the vote to 16 and 17-year-olds, and it's something the current government have said they're going to do. Do you think that could help with the democratic decline and getting people more involved from a younger age? And then last question, how about making it a legal obligation to vote like we have in Australia? Could that help?
So on the age issue, my instinct is to probably say yes. I know it's a very difficult topic, but I say that in the context of it's not just that on itself, that I think we should introduce children much earlier. I mean, I know children are taught about democracy through British values, but I think it needs to be something that's much more embedded in the national curriculum. We really talk about what does it mean to live in a plural democracy, and why does democracy matter? Why are we different to authoritarian states? Why do we care so much about living in a democratic society? So I think the two have to go hand in hand. If you want 16 and 17-year-olds to vote, I think the introduction of where we talk about the importance of democracy has to go together at the same time. So young people then feel more empowered in understanding the democratic process, understand why voting matters, and having a more informed view about some of the policy areas and the challenges that they will see and have to deal with. So I'd probably say those two things have to go together. A legal obligation to vote, that's a very difficult one. Instinctively, I'd probably say no, just because I think individual liberty is a very important aspect of our country. And I think, if you reach a stage where we're forcing people to vote, I kind of feel like we've lost the debate already. Because, you'd want people to vote because they know their vote matters. If they've reached a point where they feel their vote doesn't make a difference, it doesn't matter, that's where the problem is. It's not about forcing them to vote. We should be making sure that people feel so engaged and so passionate about their country and how they want their country to be that they will go out and vote. We don't need to force them to vote. They will go out and vote because they care enough. So my instinct is probably not to force to have a legal obligation to vote.
Thank you. I just wanted to come back to the Office for Social Cohesion and Democratic Resilience that you've proposed. Did you get pushback from government on this at all, or have you had any response?
There's always, if anybody suggests an independent body or an arm's length body, there's always some kind of pushback. I published my report and 2 months later it was the election, so I didn't have that much conversation. What I would say to the government is, look, one of the reasons I suggested this office was because, as I said earlier, having worked with 5 secretaries of states during my time when I was doing the review at MHCLG, having seen firsthand how political interest sways, how, again, entire programmes can be disrupted because of other crises or other issues, you can see how social cohesion will just fall off the agenda. Whereas if you had an office who has a mandate no, it doesn't matter what the political winds are or issues or crises that are happening, they will continue their work. They will produce that framework. They will continue measuring social cohesion. They will keep on producing this yearly report of the state of social cohesion and democratic resilience. They will continue the research and building on what works to improve tensions or to counter conspiracy theories. That work has to continue, and I just fear that if you leave it inside MHCLG, dependent on which minister's in charge, it could just fall off the bandwagon. I think it's too serious of an issue to then not outsource it, who then that particular office has the mandate and can demonstrate and keep progress moving on social cohesion, and in effect help to institutionalise it in a way to date that we haven't been able to do so.
Thank you. Rosie.
Thanks, Chair. I just want to move on to your work on freedom restricting harassment. Could you just give a really brief summary or definition of what that means for those in the audience and at home who aren't aware?
So I came up with this definition, and believe you me, it was not easy coming up with 3 words like that. We had all kinds of strange wordings, but it was in recognition of, look, there's this phenomenon in our country where people are experiencing severe levels of harassment, abuse and intimidation, and it's resulting in them censoring themselves. And obviously we've talked a lot about, in the public domain, about how parliamentarians first and foremost are experiencing this. But actually this is a much wider phenomenon that's affecting all aspects of society, and we can talk about that. But from a definitional point of view, I described it as when people experience or witness threatening, abusive, intimidatory harassment, online and or offline, which is intended to make people or institutions self-censor out of fear. So it's not just looking at harassment on its own, it's not looking at self-censorship on its own, it's how harassment, people experiencing and are being targeted for harassment, is then leading to them to self-censor in a whole variety of different ways. And that phenomenon is something that is not really being captured by existing harassment legislation. But it's very much about bringing those 2 phenomena together.
Thank you. How does that particular thing directly impact social cohesion, in your opinion?
It affects social cohesion in a number of different ways because, as I showed in the report, it's an attack on parliamentary business. It's making and it's forcing parliamentarians to think about whether they should vote or work in a certain way, which is, in effect, restricting the ability of parliamentarians to work freely as they've been given the mandate to do so. It's affecting journalism and the free press in this country. If 7 out of 10 journalists are too scared to report on certain stories because they fear harassment and abuse, that's an attack on our free press. It's poisoning the lifeblood of our free press. If you have councillors, 9 in 10 councillors, telling you that they've experienced abuse and threats, and threats, and 27% are saying they're unwilling to take office again, and out of that 27%, 68% are saying it's because of the abuse that they're experiencing, that is going to curtail the diversity of councillors that we have in this country because they feel too frightened to take part in public life. I spoke to NGOs who told me that they're experiencing freedom restricting harassment, where they have to change their routes to work, where they and their staff members have experienced death threats, where people are leaving that area of work because of freedom restricting harassment. So it's affecting civic society, and we know civic society is a very fundamental part of our democratic society. If you have the arts sector saying, if 80% are saying we're being ostracised because of the work that we put out, and 45% then saying we experience harassment, abuse and threats, and then 44% of that 45% are then saying, so almost all of them saying, as a result, we have changed what we have put out, that's affecting the arts and culture sector. I mean, for me, freedom restricting harassment is affecting and poisoning every aspect of our democratic way of life. It's really insidious, I think, in that way, because it's not something acute like a terrorism act where everyone can see what's happening. It's where people are forcing themselves to self-censor because of this growing and horrendous climate of abuse and threats. And, one of the things I wanted to do was to understand the scale of this, because I said there's no kind of real figures. And so when we commissioned a national representative poll, it just showed to the extent how people are experiencing freedom restricting harassment, where 60% of the population believe it's increased more than 5 years ago. 85% of the population believe it's happening in our country. 2 in 5%, so 44% of people said that they had witnessed it online, but equally also witnessed it offline, which completely discounts this myth that this is only some kind of online phenomenon. And 27% of people saying that it had left them fearful and caused them to alter their way of life, where people have taken security measures, where they've left their homes even or left their jobs. That's a serious consideration on our so-called free society. And it was interesting because one of the things I found most interesting was how the public felt about freedom restricting harassment, where around 7 in 10 people said that they thought it restricts their ability to live freely. It restricts their ability to, and is pushing people away. It's not allowing them to work together. It's deterring people from contributing to public life, and it's undermining social cohesion. So it has a direct correlation to social cohesion and our democratic society and how we live as a country.
Thank you. You mentioned NGOs, and in your report in section 2.4 you mentioned the case between two NGOs, Mermaids, the Charity Commission, and LGB Alliance. Basically, they didn't agree with each other and essentially were trying to, one charity was trying to ban the freedom of another one, and you've said there's no legal right to be free from criticism by those who disagree with you, or prevent
what those said.
Or prevent those who hold beliefs that the law recognises as protecting themselves from expressing themselves. What would your recommendation be to those groups for them to be able to operate without other groups trying to ban them?
I mean, again, I think this just shows why social cohesion is so important, because, again, this kind of... And I think, by the way, freedom restricting harassment is a much greater phenomenon than cancel culture. But this attempt to shut down legitimate activity in a democracy, I think, is just untenable. People have all kinds of views, and the biological sex versus the gender identity debate, as we all know, has been very, very toxic. And there's got to be a space where we can talk about those things in a civilized way, where we can passionately disagree and even get angry. But I think as a society we have to acknowledge that there are certain red lines. If you start threatening people, if you start doxing and releasing people's addresses online, you've crossed a red line. And passionate, angry debate is something that is great about living in a democracy. But it feels like to me those red lines increasingly become blurred, where we feel it's justified. We feel so passionate about our beliefs. We think it's okay to dox somebody or to threaten them and make them feel frightened for their life. Those red lines have been crossed, and I think, yes, we can talk about the role of the police, but it's a wider public debate we need to have about we can't live in a democracy if we don't respect those red lines. If I want people to respect my views, I have to respect other people's views. It doesn't mean I'm going to agree with you, but it's got to be done in a way where I'm not, and we recognise and agree the consensus of what those red lines are.
Who do you think?
Sorry, just one second.
Question,
I'm just going to intervene, if that's okay. Thank you. I wanted to just bring you to that point where you said about having good, healthy debate, and I would like to say that the Women and Equalities Committee were able to have a good, healthy debate on puberty blockers, something that we've not been able to have, I would say, in public and political discourse for some time.
Yes.
And we actually had a panel of experts that didn't always agree. But like you say, they were able to have that discussion and that space to be able to do that in a way that was respectful and understanding. And actually, we all gained greater understanding as well. And I think when it comes to that, where we draw those red lines, I do think when you said about possibly an area for independence and kind of constraints and codes of conduct for MPs in particular, this should be a space. Is that something that you have experienced as well?
As in having the space, I mean, there's a definite demand for it. People want to be able to debate these issues, and they want to feel, they want to feel like they can do it without worrying they're going to get death threats. I mean, again, this is why freedom restricting harassment is so insidious, because the greater that phenomenon grows, the more difficult it becomes to have those conversations where you are able to talk about it. Because if you think you're going to talk about it and people are watching online and then they are going to start giving you death threats, some people, because everyone's got different levels of resilience, some people will be like, I don't care, I'm going to talk about it. Others will be like, I am not going to say what I have every right to talk about. And that's what makes FRH so insidious. But the sense that I get is, and even if you look at polling, the British public, they believe that we should be able to disagree on all kinds of issues, but that we do it in a way that is not harmful or really hateful to each other, and that is impeding our ability to get on well with each other. That's very clear from the polling. So it's about how do you create that space, how do you inhibit this kind of, it is a growing cultural phenomenon in our country of where people think it's okay to engage in threatening, harassing, abusive behaviour just because I don't agree with your political view on whatever, or any type of view. It's okay for me to start targeting you or start doxing you or inciting violence against you or your family or trying to get you fired from your job. How do you curtail that? And it's not about I personally don't think legislation can fix this. This is about us as a country and why it's so important to social cohesion.
I agree in the social cohesion part, and that is not necessarily something where how we police our conversations and how we set an example is always reflected actually in the media. So, for example, that really productive and I would say informative session wasn't always reported as such. And I think that there is some work to be done across all of our... I know Prime Minister's Questions is possibly the most viewed part of politics, and yet it's probably the least informative, let's be honest. It's the most combative, it's the most theatrical, but does it show us politicians at the best light? Or would perhaps, where we are working cross-party, it may not be as exciting, but actually probably could show us in a better light if the media were more interested in that. Christine, and then come back to Rosie to finish her section.
That's a fascinating point, and actually... for my sins, as well as being a politician, I'm a former journalist, and it seems to me sometimes that we've got to the point where the space isn't available because what newspapers need, what the media needs, what it feeds on is controversy. People are not interested in reading a newspaper or watching a bulletin that says, well, it all went fine today, nobody fell out. So we're building this the whole time. And as well as making it difficult for people to put their head above the parapet and say, actually, I don't agree with that. You're harassing these people. What you're saying is not fair. We're forgetting that the people that we're talking about are getting the impact of seeing that everybody's fighting about them. Whether it's an ethnic minority, whether it's the LGBTQ community, all they are getting in the media is that people are lambasting each other and saying bad things about them. And that must give them a feeling of being dissociated from society. Their cohesion and their feeling of belonging to a society that doesn't want to help them, or only wants to argue about them, must be exacerbated by that and make the space that you're talking about much more vital.
Absolutely. And again, it's one of those things where, you know, when authoritarian states despise, and they make it very clear they despise freedom of expression, it's because they look at democracies and they think, well, this is what happens. You know, you guys are all over the place, and you know, there's no order. And of course, we're all going to disagree with authoritarian states and what their view is, and never support their view on freedom of expression. But, you know, sometimes I think the way we talk about free speech in this country, we act as if it's an unqualified right. It isn't, and, you know, I'm sure you're very aware of this. It's a qualified right, and it can be restricted because, of course, freedom of expression is an important aspect of democracy. You can't have freedom of, you know, you can't have democracy without freedom of expression. But equally, the reason why it has to be, in certain circumstances, curtailed is because free speech can also threaten democracy. And I feel like we've lost that balanced discussion and view, which is very much enshrined in our own legislation. The public debate about free speech has just become so polarised now. And again, I think that's part of the challenge in all of this, where you have some absolutists who will say, sorry, nothing should be censored, you can say anything and everything, people can put out whatever, awful stuff online, it's not a problem, to other people who want to curtail everything and don't want anybody to say anything, and they'll call everything under the sun if you have legitimate views. We just seem to have lost that debate around freedom of expression. It seems to me it's got worse and worse as time has gone and has turned itself into a bit of a culture war.
Thank you. I had some questions at the end about education in schools, but I will follow them up with written evidence, if that's okay, for written answers. Rosie.
Thanks. Okay, you were talking about earlier, you touched on the Online Safety Act, and you've also mentioned the police. I mean, I get death threats, probably, I would guess, more than most people on here, at least a few a year, but I then have to turn to the police. But anyone can say anything they want about wanting to kill me on social media because they don't like my views. Who is it you think ought to be responsible for that, or stopping that happening to some of the new colleagues who have yet perhaps to experience that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really sorry to hear that, Rosie. I've heard how awful the threats are that you've received, and when I was doing my review, I honestly lost count the number of times people in public life were telling me this, including councillors, politicians, other people, where they'd go to, they would go to the police and say, look, here are public forums where they're literally threatening to kill me. And the police's response would be, yes, but it's not being directed at you. It's on a public forum, and under the Protection of Harassment Act, we can't do anything about it. Or I had public figures and parliamentarians saying to me, the police are actually blaming me. They're saying, well, you've put yourself out there in the public limelight. You should expect this. Or, well, this is part of free speech. Honestly, I lost count the number of times people said that to me, which is absolute nonsense. And so there seems to me, again, confusion about the Protection of Harassment Act, the malicious communications legislation. There's a lot of legislation out there. And everyone I spoke to said, we don't need more legislation. What we need is better training and ensuring proper implementation of training, because when there are clear-cut examples where the police should actually be investigating people, they're not doing it. They're just blaming, they're saying it's either a free speech issue or whatever. So that's something that I raised in the review, which I think is really concerning. And, I'm going to, give a bone to the College of Policing and to their argument. They'll say, look, it's become really difficult about when the Protection of Harassment Act talks about causing alarm, distress. I can't remember what the third one was. It's a very subjective view. I mean, something that somebody may consider alarming and distressful isn't alarming and distressful for somebody else. So policing that line becomes quite difficult for the police, especially now when there's just so much abuse going on online that they said to me it's unscalable. We can't deal with it because there's just too much of it. So it's a real problem, but I do think that I do worry that the police are not dealing with this in the way that needs to be dealt with existing legislation, which is why one of the recommendations I suggested was that every police force should have a safety officer whose focus is specialism on harassment legislation, who can provide adequate support for victims who felt that instead it was victim blaming rather than being supported, and perpetrators were being allowed to get away with it. So that is one of the recommendations that I put forward that I think would be very, very helpful in providing support to victims and going after perpetrators.
Thanks, Sara. Thank you and thank you, Rosie. Thank you so much for your expertise and your time on the panel today. I know that you have another appointment, so I'm really grateful for your time today, as I'm sure the rest of the committee is. That brings proceedings to a close. Order.